Thank you. Before I go on to the next item of business, I have to say there is no time in hand now whatsoever. So if you take interventions, you'll have to absorb them, I'm afraid, into your time allocation. The next item of business is a debate on motion 22955 in the name of Michael Russell on legislative consent to the internal market bill. Can I ask those members who wish to speak in the debate to press the request to speak buttons now? I call Michael Russell to speak to and move the motion. Cabinet Secretary, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, today we are faced with no ordinary decision about whether to give or withhold approval to a Westminster bill. For this debate is actually about a decision regarding the value of this Parliament and the people we serve, and whether we are prepared to stand up for them or allow a UK government to, and I quote, fundamentally overwrite and undermine a material part of the system of devolution that has operated in the UK for more than 2 decades. That devolution settlement came into being because of a decisive vote by the people of Scotland in 1997. Labour, and I'm happy to acknowledge Scotland's debt to the party and to Donald Dewar, legislated for that devolution referendum, and my party campaigned with them, Liberal Democrats and the Green Party, in favour of establishing this institution. We did not agree on the process that led to that vote, but when the choice came, the SNP backed what the people of Scotland wanted, and now when that choice is again in front of us, we do so again. I was part of that campaign, working with many, including Alec Rowley, to persuade our fellow citizens to mark their ballot papers with a double yes. And I'm in the same company again, though I do not relish the circumstances. I'm sure that Labour, the Liberal Democrats and the Greens will repeat today their commitment to what the people wanted then, as will we. Our vote will follow our voice. But alas, the Tories, no doubt, will again be true to their stance then, a stance taken directly against the will of the Scottish people. They were against empowering their fellow citizens then, and they're still against doing that 23 years later. Leopards don't change their spots. And having been rejected then, they've gone on being rejected, most recently in last December's Westminster election. Yet despite that, they are still seeking to take a wrecking ball to Scotland's Parliament and Scotland's democracy. That wasn't in their manifesto, but it was clearly in their minds then and always has been. I give way.
Liz Smith.
Grateful to the Cabinet Secretary taking an intervention. Does he accept that the internal market bill is very much about protecting jobs and investment in Scotland, and that is absolutely critical?
But the answer is no, I do not, and indeed the fact-checking service proves that that is not the case. But as I said, wrecking Scotland's Parliament was not put to the Scottish people by the Conservatives, but it is what they intended to do, and it is what they are trying to do. Presiding Officer, the memorandum before us today makes clear that if the bill becomes law, then the legislative powers of the Scottish Parliament and the executive competence of Scottish ministers as they've been understood since 1998 would in many cases cease to exist. But as well as an assault on devolution, this bill is a recipe for regulatory incoherence and a race to the bottom. It is also a breach of international law. Presiding Officer, the fundamental principle of the ministerial code is that ministers must not knowingly break the law. That in itself is an incontrovertible reason why Scottish ministers cannot recommend legislative consent for the bill, but I would also argue that no member of a Scottish Parliament elected to serve the people of Scotland could ever recommend consent to such a bill. Members will be familiar with the main provisions, but let me go through them. The bill contains sweeping new blanket mutual recognition and non-discrimination provisions at parts 1 and 2, and these would require Scotland to accept lower standards relating to food, as pointed out by Food Standards Scotland, to the environment, as pointed out by Environment Link, and building materials, as pointed out by the Royal Incorporation of Architects, and those regardless of the views of the Parliament or the wishes of the people of Scotland, and the scope of those powers can be unilaterally changed by UK ministers and only by UK ministers. There are new measures for mutual recognition of professional qualifications that cause grave concern to bodies such as the General Teaching Council. There's a new oversight body tasked with second-guessing the policy choices of this Parliament, including in things like in the public services like the health service or public water supplies. Measures at Part 5 of the bill break international law and betray a cynical disregard for Northern Ireland, which has already alienated many, including the EU. There are sweeping new spending powers in Part 6 that threaten the devolved Scottish budget and transfer decision-making over areas of devolved spending from the Scottish to the UK government. State aid will be reserved, which could affect, for example, agricultural subsidy, and the whole Act would be placed permanently beyond the powers of this Parliament to mitigate or ameliorate. For those reasons, the bill is wholly unacceptable and should be rejected. The deceit practised by the UK government with regard to this bill is now a matter of public record, thanks to yesterday's leak of documents that show the truth about how it was deliberately withheld from the devolved governments. But there have been other deceits too. Firstly, the ridiculous assertion that the bill represents a power surge. The opposite is true, as the explanatory notes make clear. In fact, there will be a new blanket constraint on the exercise of the Parliament's powers, and the scope of the constraints can be adjusted at any time at the discretion of UK ministers, regardless of other views. Secondly, there are the repeated assurances that the bill will not lead to a race to the bottom in standards. But the UK currently enjoys high standards by virtue of EU laws still applying during the transition period. Under the bill, should Scotland wish to maintain those standards, would be forced still to recognise lower standards set elsewhere in the UK. And the UK government has blocked, no, I will not. UK government has blocked every, because I'm just coming to one of your key assertions. The UK government has blocked every proposed move to provide legal guarantees that high environmental, animal welfare and food safety standards would prevail. Thirdly, let me rebut the claim that this bill is necessary merely in order to replace at UK level the system of UK market rules. In fact, the bill introduces a system of unqualified powers for UK ministers to effectively impose rules on the whole of the UK, even in devolved areas, which is the very opposite of the principle of codecision and agreement between sovereign member states that lies at the heart of the EU rules. EU single market rules also recognise policy objectives alongside market considerations, and the principles of subsidiarity and proportionality are crucial aspects of them. And finally, let me talk about jobs. Mr. Lockhart's amendment talks about the 550,000 jobs being protected by this bill. Nonsense. In fact, nonsense on stilts, as exposed in the Ferret fact-checking website last night. Presiding officer, they don't like the truth. Presiding officer, at the end of December, the UK and Scotland will leave the Brexit transition period. The transition is ending because of the astonishing and reckless decision of Boris Johnson to refuse an extension that was on offer despite the fact of a global pandemic and a deep economic recession. Yet even at this late stage, the possibility of leaving in the worst possible way with no deal remains. And even if there is a deal, it will be a low deal, vastly inferior to what we experience now and hugely disadvantageous to business and disruptive to everyday life. So, Presiding Officer, the real jobs threat comes not from the devolved administrations, but from the Brexiteer ultras who have captured the Conservative Party, and those in this chamber who have meekly accepted their writ, no doubt because it saves their own jobs. The way to avoid all this damage is not only clear, but to hand. We can do so by returning to the voluntary common frameworks process devised by the devolved governments in the UK, which, despite our differences over EU exit, has been able to make progress over the last few years. Frameworks are based on principles of equal negotiation and agreement. If there are any missing areas, as claimed by Michael Gove very late in the day, we commit ourselves to closing those gaps. We're also willing to act as if all the frameworks were already in force whilst they're being finalised. And I think the same commitment is being made in Wales. So if the UK does that, we could move on from this present impasse and the deepening crisis. Presiding Officer, this bill is not only unacceptable to the devolved governments, it is also unacceptable to a wide range of organisations and individuals across Scottish society who are deeply worried. Now, of course, there are differing views of Scotland's ultimate constitutional destination across this chamber. But regardless of those views, we can come together today. We can say on behalf of the people of Scotland that we do not consent to this bill. We can stand up against this Tory power grab and urge the UK government to change course. And therefore, Presiding Officer, I move that the Parliament agrees not to consent to the United Kingdom Internal Market Bill, as it reduces and constrains the competence of this Scottish Parliament and breaches international law.
Thank you very much. And I now call on Ruth Crawford to open on behalf of the committee. Convener, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. If I could begin by, first of all, thanking all of the committee members for their very hard work and commitment in completing so many reports this week, and also to our clerks for the significant help and advice they provided in our work. Presiding Officer, it's with some regret that I speak on behalf of only 8 members of the committee this afternoon. As members know, I've always sought as a convener to try where possible to reach a consensus on committee reports, and in the main, we've managed to do so. However, there's a clear division of views between the majority of the committee and our Conservative Party colleagues on the UK Internal Market Bill. This is disappointing, given that the other 8 members on the committee have agreed that the bill undermines the whole basis of devolution. Our view is that the devolution cannot work if the Westminster Government simply imposes its view on how the UK constitutional arrangements should evolve following Brexit. Unfortunately, the bill aims to do just that, both in relation to its substance and the way it's been handled. Our most significant concern is with the market access principles of mutual recognition and non-discrimination. Mutual recognition in particular is potentially much more far-reaching than the equivalent EU principle. This is primarily for 3 reasons. First, the list of exclusions on public interest grounds from the application of the principle are much narrower. And second, UK ministers have the power to amend that list without any requirement to seek consent or consult with the devolved governments. Third, the asymmetrical structure of the UK internal market. Given the relative size of the English economy and population, inevitably it will be market forces which determine regulatory standards. Why would any devolved government then want to potentially put their own economies at a competitive disadvantage by seeking higher regulatory standards, which can then be undermined by imports from other parts of the UK which don't need to meet those same standards? This means in reality that regulatory standards agreed by the UK Parliament would effectively be imposed on the devolved nations. The committee heard that this approach is significantly different from the approach taken in the EU and other internal markets. Dr. Emily Lydgate from the University of Sussex told us, and I quote, "The core of any approach to an internal market that is as integrated as the UK's has to be harmonised rules that have a strong consultative process underlying them. The rules cannot simply be set by one of the countries." Presiding Officer, the committee's view is that it's unacceptable that the UK government should seek to effectively impose new reservations on the devolved competencies through this bill. This is not myth-making, as the Duchy of Lancaster would have it, but a clear consequence of the proposed market access principle in the context of the relative size of England's population and economy. The UK government has argued that the agreement of common frameworks means that the market access principles will only apply in a limited number of policy areas. But it's not clear how common frameworks can address the threat to devolution in this bill. In areas where the devolved governments may wish to have higher standards than the minimum standards agreed in frameworks, these will be potentially rendered ineffective by the market access principles. Consequently, there needs to be far greater clarity about how both statutory and non-statutory frameworks would interact with the market access principles. The committee also considered the provisions in the bill to reserve state aid. The committee agrees with the Scottish Government and Welsh Government that state aid is a devolved matter. Any future legislation on subsidy control should be agreed between all of the 4 governments and legislators across the UK through the Common Frameworks process. The committee therefore recommends that the reservation of subsidy control is unnecessary and should be removed from the bill. Part 6 of the bill will provide the UK government with a single, comprehensive statutory power to provide financial assistance across a range of policy areas throughout the whole of the United Kingdom. The committee's view is that it's regrettable that Part 6 has not been subject to any public or parliamentary consultation. It's also regrettable that the views of the devolved governments were not sought. We reiterate the findings of our report on structural funds post-Brexit. In particular, that any UK-wide replacement of EU structural funding should replicate some of the aspects of the current structural funds approach. We consider the decision-taking powers that the Scottish Government currently exercises under structural funds should not be reduced under any future UK approach. Second Officer, the committee previously recommended that there is an onus on all four governments and legislators across the UK to work constructively together to seek a solution to the complex and challenging issues arising from leaving the EU internal market. The committee recommended that this must be achieved through mutual trust and respect for the UK's existing constitutional arrangement. The committee concludes that it is highly regrettable that in relation to the internal market bill, this has not happened. The committee is dismayed that the UK government has instead adopted a hierarchical approach through which its default position is to impose new limitations on devolution which go way beyond the previous limitations of EU membership. The committee's view is that devolution cannot work on the basis of a Westminster government imposing its view on how the UK constitutional arrangements should evolve following Brexit. The committee therefore recommends that the Parliament does not agree consent to the UK internal market bill. Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much, Mr Crawford. I now call on Dean Lockhart to speak to move amendment 22955.1 on behalf of the Conservatives. Mr Lockhart.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. I move the amendment in my name. There's been a lot of noise surrounding the UK internal market proposals, but surely the priority, when further restrictions have just been announced on economic activity, must be to protect the 550,000 jobs and livelihoods and the 60% of trade that depend on barrier-free access to the UK internal market. That's certainly the view of key stakeholders, such as the CBI and the NFUS, who have given evidence the internal market is extremely important, more important than the EU market and the rest of the world put together. And, Presiding Officer, that's also our priority. On the other side of this debate, I do recognise there are legitimate questions over how these proposals might work in practice, but too much focus has been on constitutional scaremongering and on hypothetical concerns. Take, for example, paragraph 13 of the LCM, which claims that the bill will result in declining standards, what the Cabinet Secretary referred to as the race to the bottom, a claim utterly devoid of any factual evidence, because the inconvenient truth for the SNP is that the UK government has introduced higher domestic standards than the EU across a vast range of areas. Just weeks ago, the first major, let me make progress, just weeks ago, in the first major free trade agreement signed following Brexit, the economic partnership with Japan, far from lowering standards, this deal goes way beyond the scope of the EU-Japan free trade agreement and has increased the number of protected geographical indications for Scottish produce, meaning that Scottish salmon, cheese, wool and beef will now have much higher levels of protection in the Japanese market. And in relation to the SNP's poster child for lowering standards, the proposed free trade agreement with the US, when I challenged Ivan McKee at committee to give real examples of his concerns about these lower standards, his response was, and I quote, "All concerns are hypothetical." So there we have it, Presiding Officer. A long history, as well as very recent examples of high standards being adopted by the UK government, in direct contrast and in contradiction to the hypotheticals we have heard from the other side. The memorandum goes on to claim that the bill will undermine the powers of this Parliament, when quite the opposite is true. At the end of the transition period, this Parliament will enjoy more than 100 new additional powers coming from the EU, making it more powerful than ever. My colleague just said it's a power surge. Absolutely. But as we all know, the SNP wants to surrender every single one of these powers back to the EU in what would be the biggest power surrender this Parliament has ever seen. Presiding Officer, the motion from the Scottish Government today states that the bill will reduce and constrain the competence of this Parliament. Again, completely untrue, because the agreed approach of all four nations is that the mutually agreed common frameworks will regulate the vast majority of the additional powers coming back from the EU. Let me make this point, it's important. And these frameworks will deliver agreed standards as well as dynamic divergence in areas where devolved administrations want to take a different approach. And we support all of those objectives. But there still has to be a mechanism in place to deal with residual elements of trade which will sit outside of those agreed common frameworks. And that's where this bill comes into play. Witnesses, I will in a second, witnesses such as Professor Keating have recognised the need for such a fallback mechanism. He gave the following evidence. The common frameworks will cover most issues, but if something arises that is not covered by the frameworks, there should be a mechanism for dealing with that. And that's the fundamental point, Presiding Officer, that the Internal Market Bill will only apply as a default mechanism to a residual element of trade that falls outside agreed common frameworks. On that basis, to say that this bill will cripple the Scottish Parliament and its devolved competence, as the First Minister has repeatedly said, is wholly misleading. Take, for example, minimum unit pricing for alcohol. Again, a good example used by the SNP. A divergent approach by this Parliament will be allowed in the future, meaning that alcohol produced elsewhere in the UK can only be sold in Scotland if it complies with minimum pricing in Scotland. Contrast that with the position under EU law, where the Scottish Government had to defend this divergent approach through the courts. Presiding Officer, in his opening remarks, the Cabinet Secretary talked about the United Kingdom no longer being a partnership of equals. But the real test of any partnership is how a partner reacts during a crisis. And we have seen the strength of the UK partnership delivering for Scotland during this time of crisis. £16 billion of additional support as part of the UK Government's COVID response, the UK furlough scheme saving over 900,000 jobs in Scotland, and this bill delivering even more investment to Scotland. But let me ask the Cabinet Secretary, what has his contribution been during this period of crisis? Spending time and money on an unwanted second referendum, walking away from negotiations on the internal market and interfering with the Brexit negotiations. So when the Cabinet Secretary questions this partnership of equals, he is the one trying to undermine the partnership. Finally, Presiding Officer,
winding up.
The Scottish motion today refers to a breach of international law, and perhaps that's what the member wanted to intervene on. It refers to a breach of international law. On this very issue, let me quote what Mr Russell told the committee last week. And I quote directly, "There is nothing unlawful about the House of Commons preparing a bill. It should never have come to the House, but that is not the same as it being illegal." For once, I agree with the Cabinet Secretary.
And you must conclude there.
I'm concluding, Presiding Officer, by emphasising the vital importance of this Parliament protecting jobs and livelihoods during this crisis, and that's why we will be voting for the legislative consent motion at decision time.
Thank you. I now call Alec Rowley to open for Labour. Mr Rowley, please, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In opening this debate for Labour today, I want to make clear that we will not give consent to the United Kingdom Internal Market Bill. And let me be clear, we will not give support to any measures that reduce and constrain the competence of the Scottish Parliament. As a political party, Labour is committed to devolution. And for the avoidance of doubt, this bill is a full-on attack on the existing devolution settlement. Devolution has worked for Scotland, and with such economic uncertainty as we face right now, it is further devolution that is required to build back a better Scotland. However, instead of taking the best course of action to protect the UK internal market through the collaboration and cooperation of all nations, we have a take-it-or-leave-it approach from Boris Johnson and his Tory chums. And make no mistake, those Tory chums, including the Scottish Tories sitting in this chamber today, will put Johnson and his interests before the interests of the people of Scotland. So to all those worried about the future of Scotland, I say the greatest threat to the future of Scotland, its economy and its relationship with the rest of the United Kingdom is Boris Johnson and all those Scottish Tories that have lined up behind them blind loyalty. And that is why I say the Tory party want to detract from the real issues in this bill by claiming the argument is about independence. It is nothing to do with independence, but everything to do with the UK Government removing powers from the Scottish Parliament and ultimately from the Scottish people. And then, OK, we've got time.
Patrick Harvie.
Grateful to the member for giving way. Surely he agrees, as I do, with Scotland's trade union movement, who said that if the UK Government proceed with this bill against the wishes of the Scottish Parliament, it makes the case for a second independence referendum unanswerable.
Alec Rowley.
It certainly demonstrates that the greatest threat to the United Kingdom is Boris Johnson and his clapping Tories who sit behind him. And then, as an added arrogance, this bill breaches international law, a fact that was readily admitted by the Northern Ireland Secretary in the House of Commons, and the bill is now under legal proceedings from the EU due to that breach. Frankly, this whole thing is a disgrace and will have massive repercussions for the UK's international reputation, which has already been suffering over the last few years of this Conservative government and its failures. However, Presiding Officer, it is not just that the Internal Market Bill breaks international law or that it drives a coach and horses through devolution. It paves the way, in my view, for private companies and multinational companies to force their way into key public services in Scotland. This bill will lead to a race to the bottom in so many areas of our daily life. The overwhelming evidence from across the world is that in this day and age, we must have more regulation, not less. The idea that everything should be left to the market is not only an outdated idea, it is a dangerous idea whose time has come and gone. So it seems incredible to be ploughing on regardless with this bill and with the Tory Brexit plan. We have supported the Scottish Government to make the case for a Brexit extension, which is absolutely necessary at this time. Interest rates are at rock bottom and the Chancellor of the Exchequer has never borrowed so much, with public debt now more than 100% of the size of our economy. This on top of massive increases in unemployment to COVID and worrying forecasts for further unemployment to come. The pandemic has wrecked our economy, but the economic cost of a no-deal Brexit could be 2 or 3 times as bad as the impact of COVID, according to the London School of Economics. Surely anyone looking at this, Presiding Officer, would say it's absurd to continue down this path and that we need to think again. That would be anyone but Johnson and Johnson's Tories. I say, think again.
Thank you very much, Mr Rowley. And I call on Patrick Harvie to the Green Party. 4 minutes, Mr Harvie.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This has been an extraordinary process leading to an extraordinary bill which poses an extraordinary threat to us all. The process cut right through the discussion of common frameworks and began with a consultation, a short consultation which could not have been more perfectly timed to coincide with the parliamentary recesses in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. It involved a refusal of the Secretary of State responsible for the bill to come and give evidence. It included no draft bill for consultation, and it includes a clear threat to legislate without consent of this Parliament. As far as I understand, the Scottish and Welsh governments were still asking to see the bill during a meeting of the Joint Ministerial Committee when a photo of the press release announcing its publication was leaked on Twitter. This could not be more shambolic. But the substance of the bill poses an extraordinary threat as well. The direct assault on this Parliament's democracy, this democratic authority, comes from the political party which opposed the creation of this Parliament in the first place. This is not an insurance policy, it's a wrecking ball. Where mutual respect genuinely exists between the jurisdictions, cooperation is possible, even when political parties with very different politics are in power. The last 20 years shows us that. But this shocking power grab is what makes cooperation impossible. There is no incentive at all for the UK government to negotiate or compromise if it has already taken the decision to ignore and overrule Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland and even international law. That's why I'm pleased to say that over 6,000 people have signed up to support the Scottish Green Party's campaign against this bill. But beyond the substance of the bill and the extraordinary process, there is an extraordinary threat behind it, a deeper concern about the true agenda of the current UK government, not only encapsulated in this bill, but in their trade agenda too. It's apparent from the likes of Liz Truss and the speech that she gave at the free market extremist lobby group, the Cato Institute, a couple of years back, complaining of the thicket of regulations and welcoming their race-to-the-bottom agenda on food, on safety, on public services, public health and on environmental protection. Liz Truss's attitude to these issues, she's far from alone in the UK government in sharing this agenda with a right-wing, anti-environment, anti-social, climate change denying outfit like the Cato Institute. They've just appointed Tony Abbott, for goodness sake, to the UK Board of Trade. Another example, someone who's worked with Nigel Lawson's dishonest climate denial lobby group, someone who's denied this basic science for years and called it a cult. The UK government is willing to bring people like that into government. The UK government is willing to break international law and render itself untrustworthy either with international partners or within the governments elsewhere in these islands. The UK government is willing to undermine human rights, willing to overturn devolution. I do agree with the STUC's comment, which I quoted to Mr Rowley, that if the UK government makes good on its threat to legislate, to pass this bill in defiance of a refusal to consent to it by this Parliament, it will make the case for a second independence referendum unanswerable, because this bill does one thing very clearly. It exposes the reality of the choice Scotland faces, and in the context of the current UK government, that choice is between direct rule and independence.
Thank you very much, Mr Harvey. And I now call Willie Rennie to for the Liberal Democrats. 4 minutes to Mr Rennie, I'm sorry.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. This legislation emerged from a hurried white paper in the summer and has been blasted through Westminster at high speed. The bill exists to smooth a trade deal with the United States of America. It gives UK ministers the power to sweep away objections from devolved administrations on matters like food safety and environmental safety. I have been astonished to hear UK ministers say that the Northern Ireland Protocol was done in haste, so cannot be relied upon. Those very same ministers are rushing through this legislation at breakneck timetable and a strong-arm guillotine, and they don't even blush. I was very interested in the expert witnesses at the committee. Professor Dugan wrote in his submission that many trade systems that rely on mutual recognition also incorporate multiple safeguards into its application. There are none in this bill. Professor Keating has pointed out in his evidence most systems with internal markets would be federal, with each of the different administrations having a say. But this bill gives power to one Secretary of State. I would prefer joint ministerial committees to be up and running with a dispute resolution process to keep the internal market moving. With the frameworks agreed by all four administrations, then the detailed implementation can be left to the individual administrations, safe in the knowledge that the fundamentals of the internal market are protected. My colleague on the committee, Beatrice Wishart, asked about fire safety standards. She pointed out that Peter Drummond, from the Royal Incorporation of Architects, said that Scotland's most robust fire safety regulations could fall foul of the bill. If we wanted to change or toughen its existing standards, the bill would appear to come into force against it. Now, in response, the UK government said, we will continue to be able to set our own regulations. But as the expert witness, Professor Dugan, pointed out, technically speaking, the UK government is correct, but only if we totally ignore the bill that we are talking about. So you would have thought that it would be a pretty high-ranking office holder of the Boris Johnson fan club to think that this is an honest piece of legislation. However, it does seem that we might have a number of those individuals in the chamber today. And that's before we get to the brazen admission that this bill will break international law. So much for the party of law and order. But yet the Scottish Conservatives still stand by this bill. This bill is unnecessary. It is rushed. It is ill-conceived. It will undermine the United Kingdom partnership, will put power in the hands of just one minister, and will break international law. This Parliament should reject this legislative consent motion, and the UK government should withdraw the bill without delay.
Thank you very much. Open debate, 4-minute speeches. Make sure you press your request to speak button to speak. I call Keith Brown to be followed by Murdo Fraser.
Thank you, President Officer. I will not vote for this Parliament to consent to the UK Government's Internal Market Bill, and I have a number of reasons for that position. The bill, first of all, by the UK Government's own admission, breaks international law. It may